Thanks very much, Beth and Nana, and all of you for the opportunity to share with you some of my own work concerning carbon cowboys who are wrangling in the rainforest for riches. This Western font harkens back to the frontiers of the American West. And this town of Telluride has, as a part of its history, that frontier that attracted many in search for wealth. And the kind of frontier where I conduct my research as a rainforest botanist is a kind of a last frontier in a part of the globe where the same pursuit of natural resources that happened here 100 years ago is going on as we speak. Now, the focus for my talk has to do with carbon. And you may, all of you, be familiar with this curve, which records the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide from 1958 up to the present day, 1958 being the time that a monitoring station was established on the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. And we have seen the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide reach a major milestone just this year. How many of you are familiar with the what occurred on May 9th this year for the first time? A few hands go up in the audience. This is the first time since the Pliocene, the first time in the last 3 million years that we have reached 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. At this time in the past, 3 million years ago, we know that sea levels were higher and that average Earth temperature was warmer. Now, this has provoked the United Nations and many concerned organizations and individuals to think about what we might do to alter our CO2 emissions trajectory as it affects climate. Now, for skeptics in the audience, I might note some of our current human impacts on the global environment that are related to our activities that may not necessarily concern CO2. Did you know that half of the ice-free land surface on Earth is now under agricultural or urban systems? Did you know that we control now fully 1/3 of the primary productivity of plants and photosynthesis on this planet through our agricultural and forestry and other activities? We are using approximately half of the available fresh water on this planet, or affecting the cycle of that fresh water. Those are substantial human impacts. And in 2008, an initiative was launched called RED, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation in Developing Countries. It was launched in partnership between Food and Agricultural Organization, United Nations Environment Program, United Nations Development Program, and this reflects the concern that much of our current carbon emission has to do with deforestation in the hot zone of the tropics. Approximately 10% of our annual carbon emissions are due to deforestation and degradation. And this program proposed to create structures through which we might be able to reduce emissions in developing countries through capping carbon emissions and trading in carbon credits. Now, why should tropical rainforests be a focus? I mentioned already the impacts of deforestation on global carbon emissions, 10% of our total carbon footprint coming from this, but there are many other reasons to be interested in tropical rainforests. For instance, biodiversity, the fact that perhaps 70% of our known species on Earth reside in the tropical zone. the role that these ecosystems play in regulating our climate and our water cycle, the many products that we derive from rainforests, timber being an obvious one, but many others as well, including the source of medicines and pharmaceutical products, and then the aesthetic and cultural values that we place in these forest systems. For all of these reasons, a number of organizations have teamed up across the globe to observe forests through an international network. And this is coordinated through the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., global forest observatories that are now located in 16 different countries. More than 70 different universities, governmental research organizations, conservation organizations are involved. And collectively, this network is studying over 8,000 different species of trees on Earth, and that is about 20% of the known species of trees on the planet. And in total, over 3 million trees have been mapped and measured and identified and are being remeasured in studies of ongoing studies of the dynamics of these forests. Now, my work has focused on New Guinea. I've been traveling to and from New Guinea now for the past 20 years. The reason I'm focused there, as many biologists are, is that this is one of those last great wilderness areas on the planet. In terms of the extent of tropical forest, it's the third largest remaining forest wilderness on the planet. The area we're talking about translates to about 1.25 states of Colorado. And although this is a relatively small land area, just 0.5% of land area, it harbors approximately 5% of biodiversity. It's also a deforestation hotspot where the carbon released from deforestation is the major the major source in New Guinea. In fact, 95% of the carbon released in New Guinea comes from deforestation, and that's because it's just not a very developed place. There aren't very many other sources of human carbon emissions. It's also a last frontier in many respects, being one of those last places on Earth to bear a colonial footprint. When European powers divided up this island, the western half by going to the Dutch, the northeastern part to Germany, and the southeastern part to the British Empire, eventually Australia. This didn't happen until quite late in the 19th century. And in the first quarter of the 20th century, this was the time when the major human population center in New Guinea was first contacted by the outside world. In the 1930s, a population of over 1 million people who had no direct contact with the outside world first observed the wheel on the landing gear of an aircraft. And it was one of those incredible moments of first contact between isolated indigenous people and the Western world. So it's remained a relatively isolated place. In fact, as late as the mid-1980s, an aviator's map of New Guinea would still show that relief data were incomplete for much of the island. And this relatively unexplored, undeveloped place persists today where, for instance, in the year 2000, here is an indigenous landowner picture that I took in a visit to a remote area in New Guinea where 98% of the land, including the forest estate, is still under the customary ownership of these indigenous people. During this relatively brief period of colonialism, forest and land was never appropriated by the government, and today it's still in the hands of these people. So this raises a very interesting situation in which the pressure and the needs and the demands for globalization are confronting these isolated indigenous people who are suddenly, through mobile phone technology, the demand for natural resources, in direct contact with the rest of the world. And unlike many developing countries where resources have been appropriated by the state, here we have indigenous landowners who, by Western standards, might have a relatively low standard of living, sitting atop major timber resources, major oil and gas reserves, major mineral resources. And these people are very keen to trade resources for access to the kind of standard of living that we here in Telluride take for granted. And that's well illustrated on the currency of Papua New Guinea. The 100 kina note shows the trajectory from coffee beans and coconuts and fish through oil palm to gold and silver, telecommunications, and Boeing 747s. And to illustrate what's been happening in this part of the world, I have a timeline from 1980 through the mid-2000s showing the map of forest reserve that has been signed into active logging concessions by agreement of local indigenous landowners and the government in Papua New Guinea. And in 1980, the map is bare, but by 1990 you can see these patches showing up. These are individual logging concessions where foreign companies are coming in to cut timber. By 2000, some of the offshore islands of New Guinea are pretty much completely covered. By the mid-2000s, virtually the entire lowland forest estate, everything apart from the rugged mountains, had been entered into these kinds of logging agreements. And these are agreements that the landowners, the resource owners themselves, have opted for. In recognition of so much forest about to be cut down, United Nations and other organizations launched REDD. And REDD kicked off a fever in Papua New Guinea, where the government, indigenous people, as well as speculators, were very interested in the potential for somehow these forests to provide income, to provide cash, not in exchange for timber, but just for not cutting down the forest. And so you can see a new ministry in Papua New Guinea called the Office of Climate Change and Carbon Trading that opened up in 2008. It opened right around the time that the carbon index on the Chicago Climate Exchange was peaking. And many speculators, including this gentleman by the name of Kirk Roberts, flooded into Papua New Guinea, out into rural areas, and offered contracts, much like the logging contracts, and asked indigenous owners to sign away their rights to harvest the forest, instead sign an agreement to preserve it. And then these so-called carbon cowboys take these agreements off in search of foreign investors who presumably want to offset carbon emissions by buying these credits somehow. This scenario raised a lot of questions. The carbon cowboys rushed in, the government opened their new ministry before we even knew how much carbon is stored in a New Guinea forest, before we knew how much corporations, governments, carbon polluters might be prepared to pay not to see these forests cut down. What would you pay to see a forest not cut down? And who would you pay? And how often would you pay these the people responsible for this forest resource? So these are difficult questions, and I want to step now to the work that I've been involved with to provide an example and an alternative to this carbon speculation that has been taking place in New Guinea. And I want to focus on on an isolated village in the lowlands of Madang province on the north coast of New Guinea, where my colleagues and I have been working with forest resource owners for a number of years before carbon cowboys and red came into the picture. And I want to describe a project that we initiated in 2008 to measure carbon and at the same time pay the indigenous landowners for the environmental services that their forest is providing. This opportunity came about through partnerships that my colleagues and I developed with these landowners. And initially, we were interested in just documenting the biodiversity. And we did that by partnering directly with the owners of this forest to document the traditional names and uses of their plants. And we call this Science in the Village. Here is an illustration of a rainforest plant and its name in 10 different local languages scattered across the north coast of New Guinea. There's tremendous indigenous knowledge of these forests. And what we established was a partnership through which we would connect scientific names, access to biological data, and document traditional names and uses for indigenous people. As we continued our studies, providing employment to local landowners as field assistants in our projects, providing educational opportunities, we were engulfed by these logging concessions. And so we initiated an effort back in 2006, 2007 to preserve the Wanang forest, where we received a grant to mark the boundary of an area about 20,000 acres or 10,000 hectares in area. And we were under some intense time pressure to do this because all the surrounding area, all the indigenous people surrounding this 10,000 hectare block had signed logging contracts. And we were engulfed in a 150,000 hectare logging area. Having established this reserve for forest preservation and scientific research, when the carbon fever took off, we had the opportunity to expand our partnership to include a corporate donor and a corporate sponsor who does a lot of business in the resource extractive industry in New Guinea. And this is Swire & Sons. You may not have heard of them, but if you're a Downton Abbey fan, you might be familiar with a Swire character, which is an ancestor of the Swire family that today is involved in much business throughout the world and particularly in Asia. This company was interested in supporting a rainforest conservation project because they're very involved in other industries such as logging and mining and shipping and so forth. And they gave us a couple of $100,000 to help us develop a project and then sustain us with annual funds. So we launched the Swire Papua New Guinea Rainforest Study in 2008, where this is not carbon trading per se, but this is an attempt to preserve a patch of forest, to study it in detail, to estimate how much carbon is there perhaps, to facilitate development within the indigenous community, and so forth. So basically what we have from Swire are, we have money flowing in. Here are money trees with annual cash royalty payments that landowners receive. The research project also receives funds that enable long-term studies of the dynamics of the forest. The research provides local employment. This annual investment includes royalties as well as community services, and it's conditioned on the stewardship of the forest by these Wanang people. And what the donor gets out of this is the knowledge that they're contributing to rainforest preservation and community development. So here's a satellite image of part of Wanang Forest as seen from space, where we have established a research plot, 500 meters on one side by 1,000 meters on the other. And within that plot, we have tagged, mapped, measured, and identified every tree greater than a centimeter in diameter. That's over 300,000 trees that add up to more than 500 different species. This area amounts to 94 football fields, if you put them all together. And we have crawled through that plot one step at a time, tagging, mapping, measuring, and identifying every tree so that we can map the distributions of individual species throughout that plot. We can estimate forest carbon. We can compare the forest here in New Guinea to other forests around the world. We can go back periodically and remeasure the trees to get an estimate of how rapidly they're growing, what is the mortality rate, and this provides the kind of data that you need to really understand the forest response to climate change, which you'll hear about in the second talk. We're developing a flora of Wanang, where you can go online and look at images of the trees. You can look at the distributions of individual species within the plot. Some of them are very patchy. Here's a species that occurs in 2 little patches. The reason for studying 94 contiguous football fields is that you need a large area to capture the kind of diversity that exists in a tropical forest. And some of that diversity is new to science. I put species discovery in quotation marks because, of course, the Wanang people have known and used many of these plants for generations. Here's one we described called Ficus rubra vestimenta, which we named the fig of red cloth, because when the leaves are boiled, a red pigment is extracted that is used to dye the traditional grass skirts in Wanang and the surrounding area. Now, these data have also contributed to an estimate of how much carbon there is in Wanang Forest. About 6,000 trees per hectare, 120 metric tons of carbon per hectare in a 10,000 hectare forest. Given the closing price today of €4.5 euros per ton, Wanang forest carbon is equal to US $69 million. What does that mean? And how, that's a question that I am not going to be able to answer. And I hope that through the support that we have brought to this area, we'll be educating the next generation of individuals who can come to terms with forest carbon and what its value might be. In association with a research project, we founded a school around Wanang, the first school within 30 miles. And it has grown to about 180 students. And in January this year, we dedicated the first permanent classrooms at that school. Initially, this was just a school built out of bush materials, but now we have a couple of classrooms with the first potable water in the area, donations of school books, and a small grant to support the cost of this. It's my hope that future generations in Wanang will be able to sustain what we've initiated as a possible alternative to the carbon cowboys on the rainforest frontier. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really excited to be here and talk a little bit about work going on in my lab and also in some collaborators' labs. So forests, I'm a forest ecologist. Even though I grew up on the prairies where there's nary a tree in sight, I gravitated towards forest for my professional work and have worked everywhere from the Latin American and Papua New Guinea tropics to boreal forests in the north of Canada. I think forests are pretty amazing ecosystems. They cool and moisten our air. They shade the land. They provide homes and shelter to many different animals. They anchor the soil in place to prevent erosion. They slow the flow of water. They're important for humans in the sense that they provide food, medicine, fiber, building resources, recreational and aesthetic resources. Forests make up about 30% of the land surface area of the globe. In that 30% of the land, they compose 50% of the primary productivity of the terrestrial land base. And 45% of the carbon that's stored on land is stored in forests, and largely in the dominant organism of forests, the trees. These forests and the trees within them are threatened, so we've heard a little bit from George. They're threatened by conversion to agriculture, whether it be conversion to pastures or conversion to row crops. They're threatened also by urban development. They're threatened by exploitative timber management rather than sustainable forest management. They're threatened by global change, including pollution, elevated CO2, and the topic of my presentation, global climate change. You saw this graph before tonight. I bring it up just to remind us that carbon dioxide has been rising. We have a measured record since the late 1950s, but it's been rising steadily. And we know a lot about CO2 as a molecule. The reason that life exists on Earth right now, that we can live here, that this is a hospitable planet, is largely due to this gas and other greenhouse gases. CO2 has heat trapping properties. It creates kind of our atmosphere full of CO2, creates a blanket around the planet that allows us to exist. And what we've been doing is adding to that. We've been adding more CO2 to it, which means we've been adding to the heat trapping properties of our atmosphere, and in so doing, warming up our planet. So the question comes up is, what happens when we turn up the heat? And in particular for me, what happens to trees when we turn up the heat? And so tonight, I'm going to give you kind of 3 stories of what happens to trees when they are warmed up. 2 of them come from my own work, and 1 from some close colleagues of mine. 2 of them are based on long-term observations, and 1 of them is based on experiments. So let's start with the first. This is an Ohio buckeye in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina, leafing out in the spring. And what I'm going to talk about now is long-term records of processes like leaf out in spring, flowering of trees in the spring, turning color of leaves in the fall, these biological timing of the seasons and seasonal climates. For a long, long time, we've known that these processes are cued by temperature, by climate, right? So you guys probably, if you live in seasonal climates, which maybe not all of you do, but if you live in a seasonal climate, you know we watch for spring, and sometimes spring's really early, and sometimes spring's really late, and when it's early, it's usually a warm year, and when it's late, it's been a cool year. So we know that these processes are related to temperature. So what happens when the temperature changes? Well, in the late 1990s or the mid-90s, a lot of scientists were saying, you know, we know that the climate's changing. Can we see signs of it in organisms out there in our natural systems? And because they knew that these processes, these timing of biological activity or phenology, are related to temperature, they thought this might be a great place to look. And so a number of scientists went back and said, you know what, a lot of natural historians in the 17th and 18th centuries, and even into, or the 18th and 19th centuries, even into the 20th century, this is Aldo Leopold here, collected these kinds of records. They kept journals. Thoreau kept a journal when he was at Walden Pond in Concord of what he saw when it leafed out, and they thought this could be a treasure trove for understanding and looking for responses of organisms to climate change. And so what they did was they went and they looked at those records and they looked for two things. There's two things you can see in them. One of them is, are there directional trends through time? Right? So if it's getting on average warmer, you would expect springs to come earlier and these events to be happening earlier through time. And then the second thing that you can do is look at, that variation between years, right? Some years are cold, some years are warm, and we have this differences in phenology, and you can say, how linked are these timing events to climate? And can warm years tell us a little something about what things will look like in the future? So I'm going to show you a record that I've been working with from central Minnesota. This is a record of aspen leafing. Aspen is actually the most common tree in Minnesota. So those of you who are from Colorado, we have something in common. What you see here is the data on the date that aspen leaves emerged. And this is a 50-year record started in 1941 by a professor at the University of Minnesota who every day on his walk to work recorded things that he saw in a notebook. And so we have 50 years of data that he recorded on phenology, on the timing of events. And from these data, we can look at, do we see trends through time? And then we've picked up this monitoring again in the present time so we can link these records together. And what you see is this up and down, this warm and cold springs, but we clearly see this directional change with, this is in the 1940s, spring happening in late April, early May on average. And now in 2013, spring happens maybe mid-April, mid to maybe the third week of April on average. So we see this shifting phenology, trees leafing out earlier, trees flowering earlier. And this is the kind of trend that those three papers I showed before and many other papers and studies that have looked at this have shown, this changing phenology, this clear signal of organisms responding to climate. And one of the things I want to point out about this is that, wow, this is 60-some years, right? We really need that kind of record to see the signal from the noise here. This is a noisy signal, and if we only had these years, we probably wouldn't see much. And so these long-term records are really important in terms of addressing these kinds of questions. So I want to take a break and throw a question out to you all, a little quiz here. What do you think the longest written record of flowering in trees is? How long do you think it might be? I showed you one that's about 60 years long. Just throw something out. 500 years. 2,000 years. One more. 2 million. Written record. All right, well, we had too low and too high. The longest written record comes from Japan for the Cherry Blossom Festival. The picture should have been was a bit of a hint. Cherry Blossom Festival happens at the peak of cherry flowering every year, and they've recorded this since 850 AD, and the data are shown right here. And you can see that variability through time, and then the last 70 or so years, pretty clear directional trends such that now, and we're probably out here somewhere, 2013, now the Cherry Blossom Festival is happening earlier than it ever has in 1,200 years. Another kind of clear evidence of organisms responding to climate change. And phenology being one of those indicators that, yes, the trees feel the heat. So why should we care about this? Why does phenology matter? Why does the timing of these events matter? Well, for trees and forests, when you break bud in the spring, when you lose your leaves in the fall in these seasonal forests, really determines the length of your growing season, right? And so this suggests that perhaps we're moving towards a time for some of these species where the growing season is longer, which means in these seasonal climates that are limited at some level by cold, we may see more growth in the trees and in the forests. which is a positive thing at some level. However, leafing early and holding your leaves late comes with risks as well. And those risks are related to frost. And we saw this in the upper Midwest this past in 2012, actually. We had a really early spring. Leaves got warm, like 80 degrees in March, and leaves came out and flowers came out. And then April, we had a pretty normal frost event that killed apple flowers, cherry flowers, and a lot of these commercial crop flowers, which led to pretty much a decimation of these crops. So these phenological events are important for thinking about how long the growing season is, but also for reproduction and for risk assessment for these species. And we're moving into a time that in these seasonal places, there may be kind of a mix of positive and negative responses to turning up the heat. How about the tropics? So George talked a little bit about carbon in the tropics. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some work that some colleagues of mine, a scientist couple, David and Deborah Clark, who've worked for about 40 years in the lowland rainforest of Costa Rica at a place called La Selva Biological Station. Has anyone been there? One person, yeah. So they've been studying trees there for about 40 years, and William and Leo have been measuring trees for them for about 30 years. They have a long-term record, another long-term record, 30 years of data on the size of the tree, the diameter of the tree. And so we can look over 30 years at tree growth in these tropical forests. So tropical forests, rainforests anyway, are not so seasonal, so we don't see signals through the timing of events, but maybe with this long-term data set, we can see signals of these trees responding to the changing climate. So again, we can look at these data in terms of trends of growth through time, or we can use the variability between years, the warm years and cool years, the dry years and wet years, to say, do trees grow more or less when it's warm, when it's dry? Those are two of the predictions for tropical forests, that it might be warmer and that it might be drier. And so this is a graph of the Clark's data. I'm going to start with this panel over here. This is temperature, annual mean temperature. So this is cool years. This is warm years where they measure tree growth. And then here's wood production. So this is how much did the trees grow? How much carbon did they take up and store in their plant body? And what we see is in the cool years, they take up more carbon, they produce more wood, they grow more than in warm years. And similarly, this graph is, this is vapor pressure deficit. I'm not going to explain this, just so you all know this is an index of how wet or dry it is. So over here, this is wet years. These are dry years, and you can see in wet years, they grow more than in dry years. So really, the take-home message from looking at this long-term data set is that these tropical trees in lowland rainforests in warmer and drier years grow less. They take up less carbon. They produce less wood. Why should we care? Why does this matter? Well, tropical forests, as George mentioned, are an incredibly important part of the global carbon cycle. They're a major sink. They're a place where the trees are actively taking carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering and storing them in the tree body, thereby mitigating some of the increases of CO2 in the atmosphere. And these data really suggest that in a warmer climate, maybe in a drier climate in the future, their role is going to be diminished. They're going to be taking up less carbon, which means mitigating less of the impact of CO2 in the atmosphere. All right, so I've given you two stories based on long-term data monitoring. Long-term data sets are actually pretty rare. It's really hard to get that kind of work funded because funders want to see results right away. And some of these things you don't see results until 10, 12, 15 years into the future. And I don't know, try to convince NSF to invest now for results that comes in 15 years and you'll never get, you won't get funded. And also one of the limitations of these long-term data sets is that you can only really look at the variability that exists now and in the past. At height, you can use warm years, but only warm years that have happened. And we're moving into a time where we're going to probably have warmer years than we've seen in the past. And so these long-term records can't really address that, and so for that you need experiments. And you guys have been looking at this lovely picture here of an experiment I'm involved in where we're actually literally turning up the heat using heat lamp technology. This experiment is located in northern Minnesota, right at the boundary of temperate deciduous forests, which are these two kind of light green colored, and boreal forests. So from tropics to tundra, in some ways, we're looking at trees today. And all of the different colors on this map represent different vegetation types or biomes, and where they come together and transition to colors are largely determined by climate, by temperature, and by precipitation. And so that means that when the climate changes, when temperature and precipitation regimes change, we actually expect these boundaries to change. And so there's been lots of predictions that with climate change, species ranges are going to shift, forest types are going to shift. In this case, the prediction is that this deciduous forest, which is cold limited here at its northern limit, might expand north as that limitation by cold is released as it's warmer. And these boreal forests that are really at their southern limits, they're limited by heat and maybe by drought, will get pushed back this way because it's too warm for them. But this is all pretty theoretical. There hasn't been much in the way of documentation of, do we have biological evidence that would support these predictions? And so we, myself, and a number of colleagues, this is not by no means only my work, I have a lot of really great collaborators on this project. We basically started a project where we said, let's test this question. Let's look at what happens when we turn the heat up. And so we use these infrared heat lamps, which you can see here, and then we have cables in the soil that are also heating the soil. And in these very small plots, we have planted a whole bunch of tree seedlings and elevated the temperature by 4 degrees Fahrenheit and 6 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1.7 and 3.4 Celsius for those of you who like the metric system, and looked at what happened. And so our study species were specifically chosen to represent these different biomes. So we have this set of species: spruces, firs, birches, aspens, like you have in high elevations here in Telluride. These are boreal species that we expect to do poorly in a warmer climate. And if they do poorly in a warmer climate when we warm them, that would be evidence that would support this kind of potential northward movement of their range. And similarly for oaks and maples that are more common in the south, we expect them to maybe respond positively to warming that would support this hypothesis that that forest type will expand more to the north. So what did we find? All right, so I'm going to orient you to this before talking about it. First off, on this side we have our northern boreal species, and as you move this way in the graph, we get more to our more southern temperate species. And what you're looking at here is zero line means when they're warmed up, they don't grow any differently than when they're not warmed up. And so if you have things below the line, like for white spruce here, that means when they're warmed, they grow less. In this case, about 10% less than when they're growing under normal ambient conditions. And then way over here, our red maple with a positive bar grows more when it's warmed up than in normal ambient conditions. And what we see is kind of a trend where we have these boreal species, as we expected, showing declines or less growth when they're warmed than our temperate species that increase their growth rates when they're warmed. So these data really suggest and support this idea that some of these species that are near their northern range limit will potentially benefit, grow more from warming, and that would potentially support their expansion on the landscape, them becoming more dominant species in those forests, and also pushing northward beyond this cold range limit. In contrast, these boreal species here, and then we have this pine that's temperate, grew less with warming, which supports, again, this idea that when we turn up the heat, this is going to be detrimental to these species. They're going to grow less, they'll potentially be at less of a competitive advantage, and perhaps be less common in these forests with their range edge retreating to the north. There's this temperate species that doesn't follow this pattern, but what's interesting here, if you know these species, is all 4 of these are coniferous evergreen species. And so this this suggests also that might not just be where you're from, but also what your characteristics are. These are all things that lose their leaves. These are all things that are evergreen. And then we have a couple species that showed mixed response to the warming. And what happens to them is that a little bit of warming actually benefits them. But when you push the envelope and make it even warmer, then they show declines. And so these are kind of nonlinear response that maybe we'll see positive effects for a while. And then as we warm and warm and warm and warm, we see the potential for negative effects in the future. So what happens when we turn up the heat to these trees? Well, I've given you 3 stories of 3 different responses. 2 of them from long-term data showing actual responses we're seeing now, and 1 from an experiment that gives us some evidence and some insight into what trees might do in the future. We see that trees are changing the timing of their activity, potentially lengthening the growing season, but also putting them at risk for damaging frost events. We see that species are responding differently in terms of whether warming has a positive or negative effect on their growth, and that really depends on, in some ways, where you are on the globe and what species you are. And we see that in the tropics, really important systems for the global carbon cycle, that there's a great potential for negative impacts on those tropical forests, and hence a diminishment of the ecosystem services that they provide to us globally. Thanks.